All right, get ready because today we are taking a deep dive into a fascinating topic, one that's often shrouded in mystery. It's the deep state.
Ah, yes.
We'll be using Johnny Harris's YouTube video, The Deep State Explained. It's going to be our guide through this kind of shadowy world. You've probably heard this term thrown around a lot, especially in political debates, really.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to go beyond, the buzzwords and the sound bites. We want to look at how this concept actually developed over time and what it means for us, for you and me today.
Right.
So think of this deep dive as, well, it was like a decoder ring, right? Giving you the tools to understand this idea, these whispers of power that we kind of hear all around us.
It's a journey, and I think you might be surprised by what we find along the way. A lot of people, they just dismiss the deep state as a conspiracy theory, something, for the fringes. But what's really fascinating is that there's actually a long, very complex history here, a story that goes way back the very beginnings of how America first grappled with this whole idea of intelligence agencies.
Yeah, it's a history most people aren't really aware of. So let's rewind the clock a bit. Let's go back to before World War II. How did the U.S. view, these spy agencies, these intelligence agencies back then?
Well, back then, spying, like the whole idea of it was seen as a necessary evil, something you only did during wartime, right? As soon as peace came along, poof, those agencies were dissolved. And it makes sense when you think about it. The Founding Fathers, they were deeply suspicious of concentrated power, and they saw the potential for these agencies to become a kind of American Gestapo, to operate beyond the control of the people, of elected officials.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that fear of unchecked power, it's woven into the fabric of American democracy.
Exactly. And it's a theme that we'll see popping up again and again as we go through this history.
Right, right. Okay, so then World War II happens. Everything changes. How did that global conflict, how did it change the landscape of intelligence in the U.S.?
World War II gave rise to the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. This was the precursor to the CIA, and it was led by this really interesting figure, Wild Bill Donovan. Now picture this. Donovan is throwing these lavish parties in Georgetown. I mean, we're talking like the elite, the who's who of Washington are all there, rubbing shoulders, clinking glasses.
Oh, wow.
And all the while he's recruiting for this brand new intelligence agency. They even earned the nickname Oh So Social, which,
Yeah, I get it.
it kind of says it all, doesn't it? And it
Yeah.
shows how, even in the world of espionage, personal connections, influence, it really matters.
Yeah, it's amazing how those social dynamics play out even in those circles.
Yeah.
So the war ends, and despite the success of the OSS, it was disbanded.
Right.
Truman, he really seemed to share that same distrust of a standing spy network that the Founding Fathers had.
Oh, he absolutely did. Truman famously said that he didn't want an American Gestapo. He was really adamant about that. But then, as the Cold War started to set in, as that chill descended, this sense of threat from the Soviet Union, it just created this whole climate of anxiety.
Like, imagine.
Suddenly, having eyes and ears everywhere, across the globe, it's started to feel necessary. It felt like a matter of national security.
So that leads us to the birth of the CIA in 1947.
Yep, 1947.
But this is where things start to get interesting.
Yeah.
Because their mandate, it included this incredibly vague clause about other functions related to intelligence.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like a blank check, like do whatever you want.
It kind of was. And that's where things get really complicated. That lack of clear boundaries, it allowed the CIA to operate with very minimal oversight. And it led them down some very controversial paths.
Right. Paths that a lot of people would say cross the line. Right.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. We're talking about things like Operation Paperclip, which, they recruited former Nazi scientists, and then meddling in foreign elections, orchestrating coups, like in places like Iran and Guatemala. And then, of course, there's MKUltra, the mind control experiment. That's a lot to unpack.
It is, and it really raises a crucial question, especially for you, the listener. How do we balance this need for intelligence, for national security, with the protection of democratic values? How do we prevent these agencies from becoming too powerful, from becoming, a force unto themselves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's especially interesting when you consider that so many of these key players, CIA directors, influential journalists, even presidents, a lot of them were concentrated in Georgetown.
Right.
It's almost like a real-life echo of those those founding fathers' fears, all this unelected power concentrated in the hands of a small elite group.
That's a great observation. And it's important to remember that those concerns, they weren't just, abstract anxieties. They were rooted in a very deep understanding of how power, any power, can be abused if it's not checked.
Right. And history is full of examples of that, unfortunately. So we've got this growing intelligence apparatus operating in the shadows, but it wasn't until the Vietnam War that public opinion really started to shift. Right?
Yeah, that's right. The war, combined with this growing unease about government secrecy, I think it created a climate where people really began to question what was happening behind closed doors. They started to wonder, who's watching the watchers and what are they really up to?
Yeah, and that questioning, it led to a pivotal moment, a moment of reckoning, and that's what we'll pick up in part 2. That questioning, it led to a really pivotal moment in this whole story, a moment of, well, almost a moment of reckoning. The church committee hearings in the 1970s. It's like, finally somebody's shining a light into that dark room we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So what did those hearings actually reveal?
Oh, the church committee hearings, those were a bombshell, really. I mean, they exposed this shocking range of illegal activities by both the CIA and the FBI. We're talking about assassinations, spying on American citizens, people like Martin Luther King Jr. There was the COINTELPRO program, which that was designed to disrupt and discredit activist groups. And then there was Operation Mockingbird, this attempt to secretly influence media outlets. I mean, it's crazy.
It really is chilling to think that all these programs were operating in the shadows for so long, with no accountability, no oversight. Was there anything in particular that stood out to you about the church committee findings?
What really struck me, what really just blew my mind was this revelation that the CIA was actually blackmailing lawmakers. Blackmailing them to avoid scrutiny. I mean, just imagine that, an intelligence agency using their power to silence the very people who are supposed to be overseeing them.
That's incredible.
It is, and it really highlights the danger of unchecked power.
Right.
And how it can just corrode, just eat away at even the most fundamental democratic safeguards. I mean, it makes you wonder, who's really in control.
It's like something out of a spy thriller.
Yeah.
But with real world consequences.
Right, exactly. It's not just fiction. This is stuff that really happened.
So after all these bombshells dropped, did anything change? I mean, did the system get a much needed course correction?
Well, there were some attempts at reform. New oversight mechanisms were put in place, things like that. But honestly, the intelligence agencies, they pushed back hard. They didn't want to give up any of that power.
Yeah.
And, it's worth noting that some agents, they genuinely believed that they were acting patriotically, that they were defending the country from threats, both foreign and domestic.
Right.
So it's not always a simple story of good guys versus bad guys.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that.
Much more nuanced.
Yeah, it reminds me of that old saying, who watches the watchman? How do you ensure accountability in a system that's built on secrecy?
Exactly. It's a tough question, and it's one that we're still grappling with today.
And then just as things were, starting to settle down a bit, 9/11 happens. The 9/11 attacks. The world is shaken to its core.
Right. 9/11, it was a turning point, definitely. I mean, it was this moment of just profound fear and uncertainty, and it created this whole new context for intelligence agencies, this sense of urgency that really justified a significant expansion of their power.
Yeah, because it wasn't just about gathering intelligence anymore, right? I mean, you had the Patriot Act, which was passed in the wake of the attacks, and that gave the government these broad new powers to surveil its own citizens. So was this a necessary response to a very real threat, or did it erode the very freedoms that we were trying to protect?
That's a question that's still debated, hotly debated even today. The Patriot Act, it allowed for things like warrantless wiretapping, expanded surveillance of internet activity, things like that. Some people, they argue that these measures were absolutely vital, that they were necessary to prevent another attack. But then others believe that they crossed a dangerous line, that we were sacrificing civil liberties in the name of security.
Right. And it's a trade-off that we're still struggling with. Trying to find that balance.
Absolutely. It's a constant balancing act.
And then, of course, you have Edward Snowden. His explosive revelations about the NSA's mass surveillance programs, suddenly the scale of data collection, it's just laid bare for the whole world to see.
Right. And the Snowden revelations, those were a real game changer. Whether you see Snowden as a hero or a traitor, and people have very strong opinions on that, there's there's no denying that his actions sparked this crucial debate about the balance between security and freedom, especially in the digital age. I mean, it forced us to confront some really uncomfortable questions about the extent to which our privacy was being compromised, often without our knowledge or consent.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, right? If you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Uh-huh.
And that feels particularly relevant here, when we're talking about the internet, about technology.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, companies like Google and Facebook, they're collecting these vast amounts of data on all of us, our habits, our preferences, our social networks, everything. And the question is, how is that data being used, and what happens when it's combined with the intelligence community's capabilities?
It's a pretty chilling thought.
Mhm.
And it leads to another question, which is, where do we go from here? How do we navigate this incredibly complex web of technology, intelligence, power, all these things?
Right. It's a real challenge, but I think we need to start by having a much more open and honest conversation about these issues. We need to acknowledge the potential risks of unchecked power, not just from the government, but also from these tech
Right,
giants.
because they have a tremendous amount of power, over our lives, over our
They
data.
do. They absolutely do, and we need to be aware of that.
So it's about reclaiming some of that control, right? Not becoming passive consumers of technology or surrendering our freedoms in the name of security. But what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, how do we do that?
Well, I think one step is to strengthen oversight mechanisms. Congress needs to play a much more active role in scrutinizing the activities of intelligence agencies,
Mhm.
demanding greater transparency, holding them accountable for any wrongdoing.
Right. And it seems like that was one of the biggest failures, in the lead up to the Iraq War.
Oh, absolutely.
The Bush administration, they made these claims about weapons of mass destruction. And Congress, they essentially just rubber stamped those claims without doing their due diligence.
Exactly. We need a much more robust system of checks and balances to prevent that kind of intelligence failure from happening again. And we need to reform the classification system.
Yeah.
Too much information is just shrouded in secrecy,
Right.
which makes it impossible for the public to have a meaningful debate about intelligence policy.
And that secrecy, it just makes it easier for abuses to go unchecked.
Exactly. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. We need to declassify more information, create a more open and transparent system of intelligence gathering and analysis.
So transparency is key.
It's absolutely key.
Yeah.
And perhaps most importantly, we need to shift the culture within the intelligence community itself.
Okay, so what do you mean by that? I mean, how do you change the culture of an institution that's built on secrecy, on this need-to-know mentality?
Well, it's a long-term process for sure,
Yeah.
but it has to start somewhere, right? We need to encourage critical thinking within the intelligence community. We need to promote a more diverse range of perspectives, and we need to reward those those who speak truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable.
That's so important, that idea of speaking truth to power. And how do we as citizens, how do we contribute to this shift? What's our role in all of this?
Well, I think our role is to stay informed,
Yeah.
to engage in thoughtful debate and to demand accountability from our elected officials. We can't afford to be complacent. We can't just sit back and accept the status quo. Our democracy, I mean, it depends on an informed and engaged citizenry that's willing to hold power to account.
It sounds like you're saying that democracy itself is at stake here.
I believe it is. I mean, the deep state, in all its various forms, it represents a fundamental challenge to democratic values. And it's a reminder that power, once it's concentrated in the hands of a few, can very easily be abused. And
Yeah.
we've seen this time and time again throughout history.
It's a sobering thought. But it also feels empowering, to realize that we do have a role to play in shaping the future. We're not just passive bystanders in this whole drama.
We're not. We have agency. We have a voice. And we need to use it.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from the historical roots of intelligence agencies to the modern era of mass surveillance, corporate influence, the power of money. It's a complex story, often disturbing. but it's one that we need to understand if we want to be informed and engaged citizens.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the deep state, it's not some, conspiracy theory whispered in dark corners. It's a reality. It shapes the world around us, and it's impacting our lives in profound ways. But by understanding its inner workings, we can start to demand better. We can start to build a future where power serves the people, not the other way around.
And that's a message worth spreading. So to our listeners out there, keep asking those questions, keep digging for the truth, and never underestimate your power to make a difference. We'll be right back after a short break. We're back and ready to step into what might be the most shadowy corner of the deep state, this whole realm of money and influence.
Yeah, it really gets complicated here.
Right, because this is where the lines between government, corporations, private interests, they all start to blur.
Yeah, you get this really tangled web, with lobbyists and think tanks, defense contractors, wealthy individuals, all kind of pulling levers behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's like there's this invisible hand guiding policy decisions. But instead of Adam Smith's market forces, it's driven by money and access.
Exactly.
So how does this translate into actual power within the deep state?
Think of it as a system of leverage, Corporations, wealthy individuals, they donate, sometimes heavily, to political campaigns, right?
Mhm.
They fund these think tanks that produce research that often aligns with their interests.
Right.
And they hire, just swarms of lobbyists to go and push their agenda in Washington.
So they're basically buying influence, right? They're shaping the playing field so that it benefits their bottom line.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
But how does this relate to the intelligence community specifically? I mean, it's not like they're selling widgets or consumer goods or something.
Well, think about the explosion of defense contractors in the post 9/11 world, right? The war on terror, it created this huge demand for military equipment, for intelligence synthesis, for all sorts of security technologies.
Yep.
Companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. they saw their profits just skyrocket.
Yeah.
As the government poured billions and billions of dollars into these sectors.
So is it too cynical to think that these companies might actually have a vested interest in perpetuating this climate of fear, this sense that we're constantly under threat?
It's a valid question to ask, for sure.
Because that fear, that translates into more government contracts, more spending, and ultimately more profits for them.
Yeah, if the public believes that the country is perpetually, on the brink of disaster, they're more likely to support, increased military spending, the expansion of surveillance programs, all of which directly benefit these companies.
Right. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle fueled by anxiety and the promise of security.
It is.
And this revolving door that we talked about earlier, that plays a role here too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's not just about, the flow of money, it's about the movement of people too.
Yes.
You have these high-ranking officials from the intelligence community, they retire and then they go and they take these cushy, high-paying jobs with these same defense contractors.
Right.
They leverage their connections, their insider knowledge for personal